This afternoon, we have Save the Sound's Green Infrastructure Project Manager, Lys Gant, and they will share an introduction to how stormwater runoff contributes to pollution and practical solutions that make a difference. Um, Please, if you have questions as we go along, feel free to put them in the chat and or to ask questions at the end. We will have time saved for questions, and if you put questions in the chat, Amanda, who's here with us today, will help me, and we'll both read those questions out to Liz. Or feel free to raise your hand at the end or just unmute to ask questions. All right, and with that, I'll hand it over to Liz.
Good morning. Uh, Thrilled to be here. I'm as Anne mentioned, I'm Lys Gant. I'm the Green Infrastructure Project Manager for Save the Sound as a part of their ecological action team. And we do, as Anne mentioned, a lot of green infrastructure work. And today I'm so thrilled to be talking to you guys all about green stormwater infrastructure. Um, so Let me just get this going. So, as Anne mentioned, I do green infrastructure work. What we're going to do first is just a little bit of geographic landmark placemaking so you guys have an understanding of exactly the region that we're talking about. So we work within the Long Island Sound watershed, which is around 16,000 square miles, in the northeastern United States. It is a watershed that starts just over the border in Canada and trickles all the way down to Long Island Sound. And this watershed covers the extent of 6 states in the Northeast. Just so you guys can center where we're talking about. And then all of the examples we're going to be talking through today are um, implementations that we've put forth, primarily in Connecticut, but as we are starting to branch into New York, we are expanding our work there. So, a little bit of an orientation for you all, for those who may not know, what is a watershed and why do we care about watersheds? So, we all, regardless of where we live, exist within a watershed. A watershed, by definition, is an area of land that drains to a given river or other water body. For us within the great state of Connecticut, and everybody who exists within the Long Island Sound watershed, all of our water that we come in contact with, that runs across the land that we live on, all ends up in Long Island Sound. So you may be wondering, why is protecting our watersheds important? So at the forefront of our minds should be the fact that watersheds, at the end of the day, sustain life. Not only human health is impacted by our waters around us, but also ecological health. Having healthy waterways can ensure that the water around us is suitable for recreation and subsistence. And then ensuring that our ecological health is robust can support ecological diversity in the environments around us. Another thing that watersheds facilitate are our $450 billion agricultural industry, which provides us with food, fiber, and manufactured goods, as well as tourism. And all of that is further bolstered by our healthy watersheds. And healthy watersheds also ensure that we have good recreational health, which means that our water bodies are safe for us to use for boating, for demonstrations, river cleanups, walks and hikes, fishing, etc. So these are all reasons why protecting our watersheds is absolutely integral. Within the great state of Connecticut, we have a number of impaired water bodies. Around 53% of our water bodies within the state are impaired water bodies. And then within the state of New York, it's around 22% that we have the data on. And you may be wondering, what makes a water body impaired? So, a little bit on what makes a water body impaired versus not. By definition, is a chemical, physical, or biological change which causes significant environmental degradation. And so when we talk chemical and biological, we're going to dive a little further into that because those are specifically impacted by stormwater. But then when we talk physical, it's more along the lines of sediment, some sort of alteration to the path of a water body, whether that be a dam or reinforcement of the banks of a river. Temperature can also be a physical factor. But today we are specifically focusing on some of the more chemical and biological components which can impair a water body. And so when we think about chemical and biological impairments, the first thing our brains go to is stormwater runoff. So some of the challenges associated with stormwater runoff are obviously water pollution. And we also think about warmer stream temperatures, nutrients, localized flooding, erosion of buffers and stream channels. All of these things can serve to contribute to a degradation of the water bodies within our watershed. When we talk about contaminants, we don't often think about the impacts that humans can have on the environment around us. So when we talk about stormwater runoff, we may not realize, but non-point source pollution, which is anything that comes off of the impermeable surfaces around us, um, is one of the number one causes of degradation of watersheds or water bodies within our watersheds in our region. And some of the contaminants that can contribute to this sort of non-point source pollution are chlorides, so thinking road salts and deicers, herbicides and pesticides, nutrients, which come from fertilizers, but also pet waste, various auto fluids, wheel debris, like tire dust, for example, which we'll talk a little more about, coal tar sealants that we put on our driveways and our roadways, household cleaners, and then a newer thing that we're starting to like talk more about is emerging contaminants like PFAS, PCBs, and 6-ppd quinone. And these are all things that are found on our roadways that during stormwater events can run off into our storm drains and then eventually end up in Long Island Sound. We have found that when it comes to impervious surfaces, so roadways, sidewalks, driveways, rooftops, etc., there is a direct correlation between the percentage of impervious surface and our water quality in our water bodies around us. It has been seen that as little as a 10% increase in impervious cover can impact sensitive species within our environments. For example, the brown trout, as mentioned in this slide. And these changes can lead to an overall degradation of the water environments around us over time. And the more impervious cover that we have within a space, the more drastic those changes are. So, what we like to think of when we're talking about impervious surfaces is when we have a rain event and we are talking about a paved area, we get around 55% of the rain that falls is captured in the form of runoff, which ends up in our storm drains in our sewer systems. Where that is something that can capture all of those contaminants and they end up in Long Island Sound. However, in the inverse, if you look at a vegetated area, we may get a little bit of sheet flow, we may get a little bit of runoff because of the fact that there are a number of plants that are planted in the area with the intent of capturing water. The water gets the chance to infiltrate into the groundwater layer more effectively than it would in a paved area. Some of the challenges we also experience when it comes to stormwater runoff is what we call a flashy environment. So basically, in a pre-urban system, so a space where we don't have as many impervious surfaces, We see natural fluctuations in the flow of water throughout a storm event. However, if we look at areas where it is heavily covered in impervious surface, such as the orange line represented in this graph, we see that the flushes of water that come through are far greater over time. So what we'll see is you'll get a large flush of water and then it'll recede a bit, another large flush of water throughout the storm event and repeat. We also want to take note of that first flush of water. That's where the arrow is signified in that orange line on the graph, because that is what is known as the first flush, which is the dirtiest flush. Usually it's capturing most of the contaminants that are on our roadways. And that first flush is an important thing to remember when we talk about green infrastructure, we'll get into shortly. Another thing to be cognizant of is in many urban places, New Haven being just one example, we also exist on something that is called a combined sewer outfall. So in the combined sewer system, basically, we like to think of it almost like a light switch existing. So on a dry day, the sewer system functions as it should. All the water gets where it needs to go. It goes to the water treatment plant and then it's discharged into Long Island Sound. However, on a day where we get a significant amount of rain, the system functions like it should for a period of time. It takes in stormwater, it takes in all the gray and brown water from homes and businesses, and all of that water gets distributed throughout the sewer system. However, at a certain point, when the sewer system and the water treatment plant can no longer handle the capacity of water coming through the system, it's almost like someone flipped a light switch. And at that point, the water, gray and brown, and the stormwater discharge untreated into our water bodies and then end up in Long Island Sound. So this is another reason why we really strive to ensure that we have these green infrastructure systems in place, because they can really help when it comes to alleviating some of the burden on the sewer systems around us. So now what? What we like to do as a way of trying to problem solve some of these issues with regards to stormwater is we manage rain closer to where it falls. And how do we do that? We look at green infrastructure, which is a type of nature-based solution. And what a nature-based solution is it is a landscape feature that's meant to mimic nature, and it's used to collect and infiltrate stormwater runoff. Essentially, at the end of the day, we're working to capture stormwater closer to where it falls and capture that first 1 inch of stormwater, which is, as I said, the dirtiest water that's going to come from a flush during a storm, inside some sort of landscape feature that allows it to slowly trickle down into the groundwater layer, preventing contaminants from ending up in our water bodies. Rain gardens come in a variety of shapes and sizes. When we are thinking residential, we're thinking usually a garden that is connected to a downspout that has been disconnected, and it redirects those downspouts into an installed garden feature. And then when we're thinking more municipal or larger scale installations, we're usually talking about pulling stormwater off of parking lots or right-of-ways, sidewalks, sometimes rooftops. And then these spaces are filled with native plants and shrubs that we curate really specifically for the needs of the space. So how does a rain garden work? So first, as we talked about, stormwater flows from impervious surfaces, whether that be a rooftop, a driveway, a parking lot, what have you, into the rain garden space. The plant roots work to filter harmful pollutants from the stormwater. And then finally, the clean water sinks into the ground and enters back into the watershed, filtered and far less contaminated than it would have been had it just flowed off the surface and ended up in our water bodies. So, on a residential scale, when we're talking about rain gardens or green infrastructure work, we have the process that we've followed. We last year just wrapped on a program which enabled us to, with the help of community partners, install 40 residential rain gardens in the New Haven and Hamden area. And so this is part of the process that we went through to ensure that those rain gardens were able to function optimally. So first we would go out to the site and conduct a site assessment, which entailed doing a visual assessment of the home, the downspouts, the topography of the yard, what available space there was, and then we did an infiltration test just to ensure that the soil was able to take the capacity of water we were hoping to pull off of whatever impermeable surface, usually a rooftop. Then we would move on to sizing. So we would take a quick look at some aerial views of the home, to calculate roof area and determine the approximate garden size, which allows us to create a planting plan. Once we have a planting plan in place, we would purchase our materials, arrange for tools, order plants, and coordinate delivery. We would set up an installation date. We would also mark the location and contact call before you dig, which is essential if you ever plan on doing some sort of rain garden installation yourself. Always, always, always make sure you call before you dig because you never know what's in the ground. Um, then we would move on to recruiting volunteers, friends, and neighbors, and then we would put an installation in the ground. Um, Usually it was a fairly straightforward process, but we'll talk a little more about how that process can be different depending on like when and where you're installing a garden. But a little more on determining rain garden size. Basically, we take a look at the aerial image and first we locate the downspouts, which I'm going to highlight here in blue circles. And then we kind of, based on where those downspouts are located, we assume which directions the water will flow away off of the roof peaks towards those downspouts. Um, we also target if there's multiple downspouts where the splits would exist at the peaks of the roof, um, to ensure that we're capturing just how much flow is coming off of that roof space to wherever we might be considering placing the garden, which lends us to this image that you see here on the right, which gives us an approximate breakdown of exactly how much square footage of roof area we will be capturing from each of these downspouts. And as you can see, signified just above, there is that space with the X in the center, which is assumed to be the potential garden space that will be installed at this property. When it comes to rain garden sizing, there's two ways that we have done it. There's first and foremost the CT Nemo sizing tool, where you can basically pull up their rain garden tool. They have a whole app they've created. And on the sizing tool, you can enter your address, you can estimate the roof area, you can mark out the roof area, and then it'll calculate for you not only the measured area, but also what the suggested rain garden size is, which is incredibly helpful if you don't feel like diving into the math of creating a rain garden. But then you can also inversely use aerial maps such as Google Maps, and use the measure tool to get an idea of the roof area. And then basically you can just do a math equation, which I'll talk a little bit more about, to determine the best size of rain garden based on the amount of roof area you're trying to infiltrate. So, sizing. If you decide to do the hard math way, basically you can determine the depth of your garden. Generally, we use a 6 to 8 inches for roof for garden depth. And so essentially what you do to determine how big the garden needs to be is divide the roof area that you're trying to infiltrate by the depth of the garden that you're hoping to install. So for example, if you have a 6-inch garden, you would divide your roof area by 6, and that gives you your garden size. So pretty easy methodology to do, but if you don't feel like doing the math, you can always use the CT Nemo tool, which is incredibly helpful. Um, when we are talking about depth, we're also talking about the creation of a garden space that is uniformly 6 inches deep. So when we create our rain gardens, We make sure that they function almost like a bathtub shape. So it's going to have a flat bottom, and at its deepest depth is going to be 6 inches deep. Um, and that may mean that, like, depending on the topography of the property, like one end, the front edge, maybe, if it's a slope, might be a little bit higher to make sure that that depth is a even flat 6 inches because you don't want one edge of the garden higher than the other. Otherwise, you could have like ponding that occurs in the garden. And contrary to what a lot of people might understand about rain gardens, they're not actually meant to be wet spaces. Rain gardens are, at the end of the day, meant to be dry. They should be able to capture that first flush of water and then completely dry out within a 24-hour period. So we don't actually want our rain garden to hold water like a pond. We want it to be able to just capture and infiltrate that water. Moving on to plant selection. Um, we take a lot of things into consideration when we're selecting plants for rain gardens. We look at, first of all, primarily native plants. There are some instances doing residential gardens where someone will request something that's non-native. As long as it's not invasive, we won't say no because, again, at the end of the day, residential rain gardens are on someone's property. They're going to have to look at it every day. At the end of the day, it's their choice what's in their garden. But generally, we aim towards selecting native plants. We also take a look at the light conditions, which help us to guide our plant choices. We take a look at bloom time. Um, we can kind of cater to people's wants and needs. So the spaces can be very wild with organic shapes, or they can be very organized depending on the homeowner's preference. We also, when we're doing a layout like you see in the top right of this slide, we plan based on the full growth size of the plants because while we might be receiving plants that are in like a 1 gallon pot, you can very easily have a plant that within 2 years gets to be like 5 feet wide. So just things to keep in mind if you're thinking of doing a rain garden on your own. And I always, encourage those who are planning to do this to be creative when it comes to sourcing plants. Sometimes something that you want is just not available, but there are generally plants that are available that are really similar or could make a nice swap out. So just be open-minded when it comes to selecting plants. If you're looking for some resources with regards to plant selection, there is CT Nemo, which is through Yukon, and they have a really extensive database of plants specifically for rain gardens, as well as the University of New Hampshire. Their extension has really, really great resources on native plants. And I can actually have Anne and Amanda share the links with you guys in the chat, following the presentation so that you guys have access to that. So some of the plants that we generally select are first and foremost going to be plants that are really adaptable. A lot of plants that can kind of go with more sun or less sun, depending on conditions, can tolerate having their roots wetter sometimes of the year and drier others because we all know that like Connecticut's weather is constantly shifting and adapting. Sometimes we have a really, really wet season, and other times we are in a drought. So we select plants that are really adaptable to those factors. We really like the milkweeds, coneflowers. We love wild columbine, the lobelias, Joe Pye, inkberry holly, which is wonderful because it's beneficial to birds and small mammals. Red osier dogwood is a great one because you get some winter color as well. So there's lots of things that we think of when we factor in what plants we're selecting. But I would always recommend when you're selecting plants for an installation, prioritize sun exposure first and foremost, because if you don't prioritize that sun exposure, if something doesn't do well in full shade, it's just not gonna do well in full shade. So I would just encourage keeping that in mind. But there are hundreds of plant options that are native to our area that do well in all sorts of environments. And those databases that I mentioned earlier can advise on which might be the best options for you. So, a little bit about the rain garden process. This is just one example of a rain garden upon completion. This was one from our residential installations back in 2019. And this rain garden, as you can see in the top right of the rightmost photo, has a disconnect, which is connected to a downspout that goes directly into this garden space. And it's beautifully planted, very happy homeowner, as you can see. And these are some of our other installations that we have done. Again, fully volunteer driven, a lot of hard work, but at the end of the day, we end up with a beautiful garden space out of the deal. Um, what I will say though is not all gardens go to plan. This slide is called Expect the Unexpected for very intentional reasons. Sometimes we end up with a garden installation that absolutely goes off the rails. This this garden installation that I have pictured here, we got to the property to find out that the 18 inches of mulch we thought we were digging into was underlined with what we think was someone's attempt at making a concrete driveway. They had thrown down some lime and sand and wetted it, and it turned into like this weird crumbly cement underneath the mulch. And at that point, we had already committed to putting a garden here. So this was our longest install of the most recent batch of installations. I believe we were there for 12 hours. It was 90 degrees. So as you could imagine, it was not the most fun installation, but we got it in at the end of the day. The garden did get put in. But as you can see in the bottom right of the rightmost photo and that giant pile in the leftmost photo, that's all like sand, concrete, jumbled together. It was not a great time. It's not a great time. But, sometimes that happens. Sometimes we get broken tools. Sometimes we get rained on when doing a disconnect. But again, at the end of the day, usually we end up with a really, really beautiful garden that makes the homeowner really happy and does a really, really amazing function for capturing stormwater. A little bit on residential rain garden maintenance. Usually for the first few months of a rain garden's life, you need to do some weekly watering, especially if we're in a dry period. Um, you also need to be sure to check for erosion. Sometimes there's high spots in the garden where you'll get mulch that erodes a bit, and just reinforcing those as you need. Removing any weeds or invasive species that may come up. And then some of the long-term maintenance, which honestly isn't a ton, is just staying on top of removing dead branches from the shrubs and trees planted in the space, making sure that you're removing the dead vegetation seasonally, pruning your shrubs so that they don't get unwieldy, doing some weeding, refreshing the mulch, usually 1 to 2 times a year, depending on how much you desire having fresh mulch in your garden space. But most importantly, cleaning out the downspout entrance to make sure that there's not like sediment or tree gunk or whatever getting stuck in your downspout, which could inhibit the water from making it where it needs to go. And then when we talk about rain gardens on a municipal scale, we talk about a few of the spaces that we are continuing to steward throughout the New Haven and Hamden area. First, I'll talk about the Mill River Trail Green Infrastructure Corridor, which started out as a 12,000 square foot space, which was a degraded roadway. It is in the combined sewer area, and it is a segment that is attached to what we hope will be the fully connected Mill River Trail. So the back half of the site connects to the Mill River Trail. This space is capturing stormwater from approximately 2.21 acres. So as you can see outlined in pink, purple, and teal, those are the areas that the green highlighted space, which is the infrastructure corridor, is set to capture. There were a few iterations of this design. We worked with biohabitats to get this designed and implemented, and we ended up deciding on the design as you see here, with three bioretention cells, some subsurface piping to capture stormwater, a secondary bioretention area, and then an overflow connection to help with capturing surface runoff. This project was a lot of hard work. It entailed removing the entirety of the roadway, and putting in a really incredible installation, some green infrastructure that really had never been executed of this size in the area before. Um, some of the challenges that we dealt with and continue to deal with, when it comes to the green infrastructure corridor are first, adjacent property conflicts. There are some continued issues when it comes to with backfill on the neighboring property and changes in grade, after surveying and design was complete on the site, which causes some issues with runoff. We also deal with basically seepage from the salt pile that brings in some brackish runoff onto the site, which doesn't make the plants thrive, we'll say. But there is a salt pile that is adjacent that can impact some of the plants on site. We also have coped with some invasive species along the property line, specifically Japanese knotweed, which is basically enemy number one when it comes to any sort of green infrastructure site. It really does love to take over sites that are disturbed soil. And so that is one that we've been contending with specifically on this site. We have also dealt with issues regarding maintenance and ensuring that the space is being cared for. We have also had issues with regards to maintenance and dumping. The site prior to being overhauled as a green infrastructure installation was essentially a dead-end road that was used for dumping. That has decreased somewhat since the green infrastructure corridor had been implemented. But it kind of fluxes depending on the season and how much exposure there is to people on the site. We have right now, fingers crossed, not had a ton of issues with regards to dumping in the last like 2 months. But now that we've been out there more and there's been more people on site, it's kind of discouraged people from dumping as much. And so that's one of the reasons why we really try hard to continue to engage this site. As frustrating as some of the challenges might be, having a continuous presence on the site helps to discourage dumping, helps to encourage better care being taken of the site overall. So we're continuing to engage this site on a regular basis. We also partner with Martinez School for the initial planting and are continuing to partner with them for additional learning opportunities through the space. And then before I move on to the next one, we are also working really diligently right now with a program called Emerge, which is a New Haven-based nonprofit that works with reintegration of formerly incarcerated folks into the workforce. And we are developing right now with them a training series that will enable them to have green infrastructure maintenance trainings under their belt so that they can facilitate the stewardship of this site, and ensure that it functions optimally, which is in a really amazing series that we're doing right now. It's a lot of fun, and it allows us to really get people more involved with this site. Moving on to the this is one of my personal favorite projects. This is the Town Center Park Bioretention Area, which was completed in 2023. This site truly has been a case of trials and tribulations for us. It was kind of the first of its kind for us when we implemented it. Um, it is a garden area that is capturing stormwater off of 73.75 acres of mixed residential area, that is upstream from the garden space. Previously, before the space was turned into a bioretention system, it was essentially a park that had a sediment-filled outfall, where stormwater would basically flush through the outfall and would absolutely just inundate the park. So much so that during large storm events, it was turning into a lake. There was so much water during certain storm events that there were white caps in the park. And then eventually all of that water, after kind of sitting in the park and capturing all of the contaminants off the roadways upstream, and all of that would drain into the Party Brook, which connects to the Mill River. So definitely something that needed to be addressed. So people at Save the Sound had a really great idea of putting in a bioretention system at Town Center Park, which has a plunge pool, a regenerative stormwater conveyance by way of a series of step pools, and then 4 bioretention cells, all with the intention of capturing stormwater and preventing it from sheet flowing untreated into the Party Brook and ending up in the Mill River. So this first section of the pool that is circled on this site plan is the plunge pool, which connects directly to the outfall. And then the lower sections here are the stormwater conveyance or the step pools, which all have a series of like unique plantings to each of them, based on how much water they hold. And then we have our 4 bioretention cells, so it's kind of a boot shape. Usually water will flow through the conveyance system into pool 1, which is right at the heel of the boot. And then there will be any overflow that comes through that first bioretention cell will basically slowly trickle through the stone weirs into the additional bioretention cells 2, 3, and 4. Um, Out of the last couple years of implementation of this space, there have only been 4 overflows of this space, which is incredible considering the fact that during stormwater events prior, it was basically a lake every time it rained. Um, so taking a look at the system, this is what the step channels looked like before we did any work on them. Um, and then you can see the in progress photo in the middle. And this is the after photo is closer to what it looks like today, which is really incredible. It was great to watch the process and see just how much wildlife started coming back, even during the process of completing the step channels. We started seeing like frogs and birds, which was just really wonderful to see. This is another image of one of the step channels. As you can see, there's some arrowroot in here. You can see some Joe Pyeweed in the foreground. Just a really beautiful, thriving space. And this is the process of the creation of the bioretention areas. As you can see, again, before, during, and after. There we go. And so this is what the space looked like upon completion. It has filled in a ton since then. But in the space, it had over 4,000 plants that were put in the ground. 1,500 of those were put in the ground by volunteers. Many of those volunteers had never gardened before. We got to work with volunteers from the Hamden Land Trust. We got to work with Save the Sound staff, volunteers through our organization networks. We got to work with a group from CTVIP who, like I mentioned, had never gardened before and were super passionate and excited about getting into the ground and putting plants in the ground for us. A number of volunteer days, all an immense effort to get plants in the ground. And this is how the space has filled in recent years. It's a really, really amazing space. It's got a ton of trees and shrubs, lots of native plants. We do deal with some intermittent issues with mugwort, which is something that we're trying to stay on top of now to remediate that space and make sure that it stays a really viable, functional space. But that is a continuing work in stewardship of that space over time. What I will say is that uh, the process for putting this bioretention area in was definitely interesting. We refer to it as the Summer of Springs. It was one of the wettest years on record for us, the year that we were actually doing the construction. And it was difficult because it really constrained our availability for doing construction on the site, but it also allowed us to test out the durability of the space and the capacity of the space for sure. So it definitely lent to an interesting installation experience. We also dealt with a number of mechanical issues. Partway through excavation, we did lose one of the excavators. It just decided to take an early retirement. So there was a period of time where the town who was doing the installation only had one excavator that they could use for the installation itself. So that obviously had an effect on timeline. Another difficulty, and as you can see, the disabled excavator is circled in the bottom right of this photo. But another difficulty that we had with regards to this space was knotweed. Now, it's interesting because the space, when we got into it, didn't have any active knotweed that was growing. But there had previously been a knotweed stand that was on the property that had been removed. What happened is we dug into the ground to do the installation of this bioretention area. And once we stirred up the soil, basically the little tiny knotweed fragments that had been buried under the soil for years activated once they hit oxygen and led to a bunch of knotweed popping up in various areas, but specifically where we had relocated dirt from the original area of the knotweed stand, which is circled in red, to the areas circled in blue as we just moved soil around the site. So that led to us having to do damage control essentially to make sure that all of that knotweed was controlled and removed before it could take over the space. We have fortunately, knock on wood, really successfully knocked back the knotweed. We only every once in a while see a fragment coming up. We haven't in a while. So we are cautiously optimistic, very hopeful that we have gotten it all. But knotweed is something that we contend with on a lot of sites that have disturbed soil because it does so well in soil that has been recently stirred up or mixed up. But as the town engineer for Hamden says, we have to celebrate our successes. And even though some of this process was really frustrating, and was a longer process than we would have hoped for, at the end of the day, we ended up with a really incredible garden space, which is helping to capture a ton of stormwater off of a residential area and will hopefully thrive in this space for many, many years to come. So looking at what's next for Save the Sound when it comes to managing stormwater or green infrastructure installation, we've got a number of things that we're working on throughout the state. And as I mentioned at the beginning, moving into New York. So we have some projects in Hamden that we're working on, which also includes continued stewardship of Hamden Town Center Park. We're installing a rain garden at Alice Peck Learning Center. We're doing bioswales in the Westwoods neighborhood. We are going to be hopefully doing some work in Brantford. We are looking at doing some amazing work in Bridgeport as well. We have continued stewardship in New Haven, and we have some green stormwater infrastructure planning that we're working on in Queens with New York City Parks. So there's a number of things that are happening currently with regards to stormwater and green infrastructure at Save the Sound. And I'm sure lots of opportunities to get together with us and volunteer on future opportunities. But we're constantly working to make sure that through our green infrastructure efforts, we are working to capture stormwater and protect Long Island Sound for everyone. Um, I think that's all I have with regards to slides. So I think that we have a bit to open it up for questions, if that works.
Thanks, Liz. We do have a couple questions in the chat already.
Amazing.
And then, as I mentioned, if somebody wants to raise their hand or unmute, they can jump in with questions as well. But I'll go ahead and start with the ones that are in the chat. Um, One is, what was the cost of that bioretention project? And that was during the oh, I can't think of the name of the project right now.
The Hamden Town Center
The
Park.
Hamden Town Center Park. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't off the top of my head have that answer. Nicole, who is on this call, might have that answer. Um, but I don't know off the top of my head what the full cost of that project was.
Okay. And then the next question is wetland setbacks. Do they play a limiting role?
Wetland setbacks. I am not super familiar with wetland setbacks. Um, I don't do a ton of like wetland restoration work. I am specifically doing urban green infrastructure work. So I don't know in that capacity how it would factor in.
Okay, and then I know you were recently branching out into Queens. Can you mention any differences or challenges to implementing green infrastructure in New York versus Connecticut?
So right now, we're only just in the assessment phase of the work in Queens. But offhand, the things that immediately jump out to me are, first of all, there is, I feel like, a lot more impermeable surfaces when you're talking about Queens as opposed to even New Haven. Um, I also will say that there are some regulations regarding um, how green spaces can be used that could add an additional component of challenge to doing work within Queens. But these are also all things that we have factored in already as components to implementing projects. So all things that are on our radar already.
Yeah, and I know that some of the Connecticut projects too were residential, which is different when it's private landowner versus public landowner too. So there's,
Yeah.
there's different factors there. Um, and that we've worked with schools in New York as well. So I think that there's different factors with working with a school project and the property there as well versus a public park. Um, we have Anita has said, great work. Have you documented your best practice approach for invasives? And if not, will you?
So we have not, although I will say that it's definitely something on our minds. But our best practices for invasive removals are is definitely evolving all the time as more information becomes available on what is actually successful for remediation. So it's definitely something that we would at some point consider doing. Thank you, Nicole. She just put the amount that Hamden Town Center Park cost. Um, but I think that when it comes to remediations, it's definitely a process that's constantly evolving as we get more information. So I don't know that we would be the best ones to provide that resource, but as long as people are interested in the resource, we're happy to share the information we have available.
Okay, and then Catherine asked, we have a lot of questions here, so which is,
Amazing.
you know, yeah, really great. You're capturing a lot of toxic products off the roadways. How do the plants break that stuff down?
So some of the contaminants that are captured, like some of the heavy metals, will get absorbed into the greenery of the plant, um, and will get broken down in that manner. A lot of the, like, if you're thinking like microplastics or salts, they kind of slowly break down in the soil naturally, which is not ideal, especially when it comes to microplastics. But when we think of it in the grand scheme of things, having the soil capture those contaminants is better than it ending up in the water because at least in the soil it's static. Whereas in the water, it has the opportunity to go anywhere. So it's not ideal. It is still something we are cognizant of when it comes to contaminants that are being captured. But it is better than it free flowing in water bodies around us.
And then next we have Anita again. How is your work accepted and integrated into Connecticut municipalities? Do you have examples of how, let me see, I have something in the way here, how these green infrastructure tools have been included into town codes? Any examples of towns? I know that
Yeah.
one of the projects you were talking about was Hamden, but that's a great question.
Yeah, so we have, because of the fact that we are really centrally located to the New Haven area, it has allowed us to really form some great relationships with the municipalities directly adjacent to us. So I think that over the last X number of years, we have really established a great relationship with New Haven and Hamden in more recent years. New Haven, I know, has done a really phenomenal job at taking the idea of green infrastructure, implemented at a municipal level, and running with it. We initially helped New Haven with implementing a handful of green stormwater infrastructure a couple years back. And since then, they have infinitely increased the amount of green infrastructure that there is within New Haven, which is amazing to see. We also have been working with Hamden on building out a plan for increased implementation of green infrastructure, which is one of the reasons why we're going to be doing the Westwoods bioswales. It's going to kind of increase their knowledge base of green infrastructure implementation, and potentially enable them to carry on additional implementations on their own. One of the things, though, I will say is that municipal work with municipalities regarding green infrastructure is always hard because they're very, very excited about the implementation of projects, but there's also the maintenance piece which needs to be taken into consideration. So that is something that we are getting pretty diligent about staying on top of when it comes to who we implement projects with, because we want to make sure that there is some sort of maintenance plan in place for long-term maintenance to ensure that the green infrastructure functions the way it should. Another municipality that we have only recently, in the last couple of years, started working with is Bridgeport, and they are also really, really excited about green infrastructure and are really pushing ahead with implementation. With Bridgeport, we did things a bit differently than what we did with New Haven, and we are going to be putting a maintenance plan into place, like a maintenance plan recommendation guide for them, so that they have that recommendation or series of recommendations to work with regards to maintaining their own green infrastructure.
Thanks. And I know municipalities have requirements that, for their stormwater,
Hmm.
like MS4 permit requirements for reducing impervious surfaces. And so these green infrastructure projects help them accomplish their requirements for permits. But then beyond those requirements, many municipalities set more ambitious goals, which is fantastic, to improve their communities. Um, and then is Save the Sound also advocating for more permeable hardscapes, roads and
Yeah.
other uses?
Yeah. So, it is not. So when it comes to permeable hardscapes, they are not as high value when it comes to ability to capture stormwater. There's also additional levels of maintenance to be considered that aren't present when it comes to a rain garden or a bioswale. So when you're thinking more permeable hardscapes, we're thinking green roofs, we're thinking permeable pavers. And there are certain maintenance requirements that are needed with permeable pavers is a good example. You need to have like a special vacuum machine to be able to like get all the sediment and debris between the tile or between the pavers for them to function optimally. So that's one of the reasons why we generally opt more for rain gardens and bioswales because you don't necessarily need specialized equipment to be able to maintain those spaces. You just need a maintenance plan. So, yes, we do advocate for permeable hardscapes and roads if a hardscape is what is needed for the space. But generally, we're going to opt for something that's more of a nature-based solution, like a bioswale or a rain garden.
Okay, and Liz, I don't know if you know the answer to this. Hillary is asking, were residents in the New Haven area responsible for the cost of the rain garden installation? And I
Nope.
think they're probably referring to the not the grant funded Camden ones, but you mentioned that previously we had done New Haven installations.
Yeah, so all of the residential rain garden installations that we have done in the New Haven and Hamden area, regardless of when, were
Okay.
funded by grant. So the homeowner was not at all responsible for their rain garden installation cost. The only thing the homeowner is responsible for is continued maintenance of the space. Um, so what I covered in the maintenance slide, which is basically just making sure sediment doesn't build up in the space, making sure that the downspout is clear, weeding and mulching as they see fit. That's it. The cost is all covered by the grants.
Okay, and we have a couple more questions here. I know we're just at time. Liz, are you available to stay on a few more minutes for the
Absolutely.
couple more questions?
Yeah.
Okay, and for those that do need to hop off, I just want to say a quick thank you for joining us. Thank you for your, caring about this topic and all of the great questions you have. Please follow up with us if you have additional questions and hang on for the few remaining questions if you can. Thanks. Hope to see you soon. Okay, so Joel has a question. Do you work with municipalities in terms of stormwater runoff entering waterways via storm drains and culverts where green infrastructure may not be feasible?
So we do some culvert work. I don't specifically. We have some other folks on the Eco Resto team that do culvert work. And that doesn't necessarily assess the stormwater runoff itself, but ensures that the stormwater can effectively get where it's needing to go. Um, I don't really touch on any of that currently. My focus is predominantly green infrastructure.
Um, Akila is saying, in addition to having the community help with the plantings and work of green infrastructure projects, do you add signage to the community for the community to understand the project area?
Yes. Yeah. So especially with the residential rain garden projects, we had signage that was placed at each garden installation that informed what the installation was and how it functioned. And then on any of our municipal sites, we have signage that details exactly what the project is and how it functions.
Thanks. And then we have several thank yous. There were some thank yous earlier on too that I was skipping over to get to the questions, but Amber, Mary, Chris, Peter, all shared their thank yous for this presentation.
Yeah, thank you guys. This has been great.